Are Western schools Marxist institutions? My next guest says absolutely that's the case, and it's been creeping up on us since, the 60s. His book is called The Marxification of Education, Paulo Freire's Critical Marxism and the Theft of Education. James Lindsey joins us for the first time on Redacted. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So it was a pleasure to read your book. Also, it was very eye-opening. So can you explain why you think why and how American schools have turned learning into activism and what's behind this? And then we'll go through topic by topic how this is pushed on our kids.
Sure. Why they did it is because the activists, and in this case, Marxist activists, communist activists, need to capture the youth in order to capture the next generation, in order to change the society that we live in. The goal of Marxism overall, or of communism overall, is to transform society to a fundamentally different way of organizing it. No more capitalism, no more liberty, no more freedom. And you're going to have a hard time getting adults to go along with that. But if you raise up a generation of children to believe that's the way to go, they have a huge advantage. They actually call this, in the academic literature about education, they call it the problem of reproduction. Societies tend to reproduce themselves, including through their schools. So we send our kids to school and we teach them American values. We teach them mathematics and reading and science so they'll be productive members of the economy when they grow up and get good jobs. And that's kind of the point of education. And that reproduces the capitalist society and the liberal democracy for another set of another generation, I should say. And so they have to disrupt that. So the way that they did this, they've been trying to capture American public schools from the beginning, all the way back to World War I, going back to the 1920s with John Dewey and Lev Vygotsky and all of these different school social reformers who were trying to create a different model of education. But they had very little success until roughly the 1990s. A new model that was what this book is about, The Marxification of Education, was cooked up in the 60s by a Marxist in Brazil. And what he figured out is that you can get around the objections, say, of parents. You can get around those objections by putting the radicalizing material, rather than just having an indoctrination camp. You hide the radicalizing material inside of other lessons. So a reading lesson becomes an excuse to have a political conversation. A mathematics lesson becomes an excuse to have a political conversation. And this method became called critical pedagogy. And the critical pedagogues themselves, as critical education theorists themselves, since in the 1990s, have claimed that they have taken over, worked their way in, infiltrated our colleges of education, and have controlled them since the early 1990s. Isaac Gottesman is one of them, and reports in his book, The Critical Turn in Education, that by 1992, critical pedagogy was the standard across all North American colleges of education.
Right. And so You mentioned how this is done. For instance, ethnomathematics is used in California, Oregon, and Washington. So it's not just mathematics, but mathematics with a sort of social justice aim, right? What are some other examples? And I think that, young people will be given this type of education and think, well, this is great. We should be learning about other cultures and things like this. We should be understanding each other. We should be wanting to make the world a better place. But can you explain why that's indoctrination and why young people don't understand why it could be bad to be a communist?
Yeah, well, the young people not understanding why it's bad to be a communist is because you'll hear a lot of times people say that we have something that they say, oh, we have whitewashed education that doesn't tell the truth about how ugly American history is. But the fact is, what we have is redwashed education. It doesn't teach the history of communism. It doesn't teach what communism looks like. It doesn't teach that hundreds of millions of people have died under communist regimes, that there's no freedom, that there's tyranny, and that there's terror, and that there are purges, and there are mass murders, that there are gulags. We don't teach our children how bad communism is, and it's because the communists control our education system. So why would they teach something like that? So our kids have no idea, and they get it packaged up to them under brand names like ethnic studies is a big one that's been standard in California since the 1960s by law, by the way. Culturally responsive teaching is another one of these brand names, or culturally relevant teaching. It's got kind of two names. That's actually explicitly a repackaging of critical pedagogy into the critical race theory paradigm by a woman named Gloria Ladson Billings. If you read her papers, that's what she says she's doing. And so that's actual purpose. We get it through the social emotional learning avenue. Social emotional learning is completely infused with this, and social emotional learning is meant to be infused into every subject. You don't have a class for social and emotional topics. You teach math through a social and emotional lens. You teach history through a social emotional lens. I'll give you an example. I think this is a better way to show how insidious it is. This is a real example from a real teacher training that was done for professional development reasons, sanctioned by the state of Indiana, not exactly a famously, far left state, Indiana. And so the teachers were taught how to take regular academic material and transform it into a radicalizing conversation with the kids, straight out of Paulo Freire's methods. And so the math problem they were given as an example, and this is a true example given to me by an actual teacher who went through this training, is Johnny is riding in the car with his mom and dad on the way to an amusement park. The amusement park is 50 miles away. How much they've already driven 30 miles. How much further do they have to go? Right. So it's a simple second grade, 7-year-old word problem. No parent would object to that problem being in their math homework. Nobody would think anything about it. But what they're taught is to use what Paulo Freire called generative themes. So there are keywords like amusement park, mom and dad, car, that are launching off points for the teacher to launch a conversation that has radicalizing potential. So you might ask the kids, who's ever been to an amusement park? So now you've used amusement park to generate a different conversation. Generative theme is the term. And so that some kids will raise their hands and some won't because they're 7 years old. And then you switch from talking about the mathematics or the word problem and you start talking about the difference. Wow, some of you have been and some of you have not been. That's not fair. So now you introduce an emotional, engaging term like fairness with 7-year-olds, and they will understand that's not fair. Some have been, some have not. So what are some reasons why some kids get to go and some kids don't? And the teachers are taught to continue to let the kids generate answers to questions like that until they say something they can use productively, like not everybody can afford it, or my parents won't let me. So if it's not everybody can afford it, you say, well, what could we do to solve that? That's not fair. Maybe the government could pay for amusement parks so everybody can go. And you have a conversation about socialism that the kids are now seeing as an introduction to more fairness. Or it's not fair that some parents can say yes and some parents say no. Is it, kids? Maybe the school should decide. And so now you're taking away parental authority and making out parents to be the enemies who might tell the kids no, where the school might say yes, and creating that wedge against the family that Marxism is so famous for. And the teachers that I talked to who went through this training in Indiana said by the end of the training, which was just a short professional development course, they could do this with any academic lesson in any subject, period.
Yeah. I don't mind. I'm going to ask you a personal question. I have read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I read it while I was getting a master's in sociology from the University of Southern California. So you don't get more socialist than that. And it was presented to us as a way to break down existing power structures, because most of us agree that our government misuses power to their own gain. So how was someone like me supposed to understand that actually this is Marxist and it would concentrate power in the hands of even the fewer and disenfranchise even more people? I guess I'm just wondering, like, how should I have known better when I was in this indoctrination system? Do you mind me asking this in such a personal way?
No, that's fine. I mean, you bring up the example of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And so for viewers who don't know what that is, this is Paulo Freire, the same Brazilian. This is his magnum opus, which he published in 1970. There are a lot of hints, by the way, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So I know you were in, school, so you were young, but there are a lot of
I was
awfully
22.
big hints.
Let's give me that pass, but
So, I mean, he
let's sort
cites
of
Marx
give the next generation of 22-year-olds some clues then.
Yeah, so he cites Marx and Lenin repeatedly through the book. He's not a big fan of Stalin, so he doesn't invoke Stalin except as a boogeyman. But he does cite Marx and he cites Lenin and he cites Mao Zedong. In fact, there's a footnote in the first chapter that I refer to a lot where he says that his entire program of education is derived from what was being so successful in Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution in China. And so the thing is it's the same question you asked me earlier in a sense. Our young people have no... It's not that the information's not there for them to be able to glean it. It's that they don't have the background context of what communism looks like or why it's bad to understand what they're seeing when they see it. And so, unfortunately, it slides under the radar. And like you said, they'll then frame it about, oh, this is about challenging power structures. This is about awakening to, a consciousness about how the world really works, which is, you guys are young, so you haven't had that shown to you yet. So we're going to kind of, initiate you into that. And it's very seductive. It's very tricky. And this is why it's so crucially important, especially with the incoming Trump administration paying attention to this, that we have to push the Marxist indoctrination programming out of our colleges, particularly our colleges of education. They, in a sense, are, this is a gross metaphor, so I guess trigger warning or whatever, but if you have a well in the town and it has a dead body in it, it poisons the entire well and everybody's going to be sick. Our universities are especially colleges of education, are the dead body in the well of our society. And if we don't take that very seriously and clean up our colleges and higher education institutes, and again, especially colleges of education, it doesn't matter what we fix in these 4 years that Trump's president, because our next generation is going to take us full bore into communism because they've been brought up to believe in it.
I don't know if you've heard this quote, but Woodrow Wilson, when he was a president of Princeton, had said that the use of a university is to make young gentlemen as unlike their fathers as possible. So in this type of indoctrination, there has to be a disdain for your current culture. That's very useful. Can you talk about how young people are brought up to have this cultural disdain from where they come from?
Yeah, this is a huge thing. And of course, it was a very prominent feature in Mao's China, since I just mentioned Mao. The history, a lot of Americans have a kind of overblown history of how bad it was in China to get kids to turn on their parents, but it was very bad. The goal was usually to get the children to renounce their families in order to prove their loyalty to the state, to prove that they were actually communist enough. They wouldn't necessarily denounce and try to destroy their parents' reputation, but they would try to cut themselves off from their families, distance themselves, change their names, very much like the transgender movement does today. And what we have with a lot of what we're seeing in education, the transgender and queer theory or gender ideology issue being kind of very on the nose for this, is this attempt to inculcate new values into the children while teaching them, your parents probably won't understand this. So they get their new values through social emotional learning, through culturally relevant teaching, and all of these nice sounding things. And then when they go home, there's a values clash between child and parent. And they've been taught that their parents, it may not be their fault, but have outdated values, old values, values that are not relevant anymore, that cause harms, that have upheld systems of oppression, that hurt people that look like or act like their friends. And therefore, they have to, be willing to be courageous enough. That's what they call them, the bravery to have these conversations. They've said that for years about critical race theory. We have to have the racial stamina, I think they called it, to stand up to their parents and say, no, you're wrong. Well, it's going to create this wedge. And like you said, it's following Wilson, it's going to create the idea that they are a new generation who's supposed to be very much different from their parents and the values their parents held. And this is a long-running, Woodrow Wilson being, kind of an arch progressive, this is a long-running program that has been designed to drive children away from their parents, again, to solve what the Marxists refer to as the problem of reproduction. Societies reproduce one generation to the next. How do you interrupt that?
Yes. I mean, I see that in a lot of different gendered ways. This rejection of your father. He doesn't understand it. He doesn't accept his white privilege. He doesn't know any better. Rejection of the Karen, the mother. When she talks, she's just, explaining something from an old world perspective. There really is no respect for our elders in our society, because it's very useful to keep generations apart because you can control the next generation in this way so easily. You talk about how Freire, it doesn't come off the tongue, and I speak Portuguese too, but
it's a hard last name.
Last name doesn't do well in my accent, is the father of woke. Can you explain that?
Yeah, the thing that we call woke so I've studied, my career has been studying woke for the last gosh, I don't know, almost 10 years, way ahead of when nobody was calling it woke when I started studying it.
Mhm.
We called it things like social justice ideology and critical social justice and third wave radical feminism and all these different intersectional feminism. We didn't have the word woke until really 2020. But I've been studying it probably since 2013, I guess, so over 10 years. And the question, of course, is, well, where did this come from and what is it? And the correct academic terminology for woke is something called critical constructivist epistemology. That's a mouthful, and we don't have to get into it. But constructivism means postmodernism, and critical refers to critical theory. So somehow it's the combination of critical theory and postmodernism. And some people will have heard those words and realize that that's some massive amount of, as Norm Macdonald put it, commie gobbledygook, which is exactly what we're dealing with. So it turns out that Paulo Freire's creation of the critical pedagogy with the goal of awakening a critical consciousness. A critical consciousness is what you have when you've adopted the critical constructivist epistemology. So everything we call woke, whether it's the critical race theory angle, whether it's the queer theory angle, which all developed, or the post-colonial theory angle, which all developed in their own niches within the university as kind of these derivative critical theory and Marxist lines of thought, kind of got put together into like a stew pot in the education schools, using critical pedagogy as the tool to figure out how to make it deliverable to young people. And that philosophy that came out of that mixture and kind of cooking down the awakening of a general critical consciousness is what it means to be woke. So Paulo Freire really becomes the progenitor of the school of thought that becomes woke. And what is that school of thought? It's this generative theme model that I mentioned to you before, that the goal of a generative theme is to find anything that's relevant and emotionally engaging, positive emotion or negative emotion, to the person that you're trying to indoctrinate or radicalize. And then to use that situation when you've engaged them emotionally over whatever this topic is. So it has to have that emotional content. And then to frame it in terms of a Marxist critical analysis of the phenomenon that you're describing. Like I said, with the amusement park, you take it and hijack it to a conversation about parental rights or about socialism or anything else.
But what you say happens. I mean, you have maybe well-intentioned people who think they're doing the right thing, but what it creates of them, and I can attest to this, having escaped it myself, is that it makes you an emotional wreck. And then you are genuinely ignorant radicals. So I think that people don't understand that they're speaking out against their own emotional well-being while trying to speak on behalf of people they don't even know.
Yeah, that's right. It's totally poisonous. The older term was useful idiots. It creates useful idiots. You don't have a basis in actual knowledge. You haven't necessarily, if this was a perfectly successful program, you would barely learn to read. You'd barely learn any mathematics, but you would be radicalized by all those lessons instead. And so what actually got me to write this book in the first place was I noticed that we have a trend happening in our society coming out of our education system. And I'd been reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed and these Freire books, and I realized this is relevant. But the trend is, we have a rapidly declining capacity in our young people for academic mastery. They cannot read on grade level. The percentages are extremely low. They cannot do mathematics or science or history on grade level. The outcomes are extremely poor. So they're not learning academic material in schools, but they also have a dramatic increase in radicalism. They're coming out for political protests. If there's a shooting somewhere, they show up at the State House to protest guns. Whatever the left-wing issue happens to be, they show up and protest. So now you have all these radicalized, politically active high schoolers, for example, and sometimes younger, who can't read at grade level. And how do you get there? And if you understand what critical pedagogy does by hijacking academic material to turn it into an opportunity to radicalize, kind of under the cover where you wouldn't notice it in a curriculum guide, then that's the saying in the Bible is judge them by their fruits. Well, that would be the fruit. That's the fruit that you would get from that education system, is people who have no academic mastery and high levels of political radicalism. And so I thought, well, this is happening, and I understand the academic literature. So now there's a connection between theory and reality. And so I wrote the book to try to describe how that's happening. It's why I called it the theft of education, by the way.
Yes. Yeah. That's an important bit of that. So I really enjoyed your book. I want to suggest that our viewers and listeners seek it out. Again, it's called The Marxification of Education by James Lindsey. And you can follow him on his website, newdiscourses.com. So thank you for your time and for coming to speak about your book and for writing this. It was very, I want to say again, personally eye-opening, but also eye-opening as a mom of grade school kids as well. So it's really helped to inform how we discuss their education and their performance. So it's a pleasure to meet you. Please come back on Redacted anytime.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so good to hear that, it's impacting you as a mom in particular too. So I'm very grateful that the message is reaching people.
Oh, thanks so much. Thanks for saying that. So we'll talk again. Thanks again.
Yes, ma'am.